by the, taken from the Ohlone people, who are still with us and are still celebrating some of their ancient sacred places and rituals. So I think we should bear in mind that fact on Indigenous Peoples Day. And in place of my usual spiel, most of us have already heard it, and those of you haven't can check our webpage and all. But I want to tell a story because, you know, Cuba has developed a very effective way of dealing with imperialists. Namely, they threw them all out back in New Year's Day, I think, 1959. And when Fidel marched into, you know, Havana, I think it was on New Year's Day, he became the first Cuban leader in 500 years that was not placed in office to serve the interests of foreign powers. And irrespective of what you may think of him, and I think most of us think positively about Fidel, he was the first Cuban leader, first independent Cuban leader. And the last independent Cuban leader was the Taino chief, the Indian chief, Hatue, who led the Indian resistance to the conquistadores. And when they captured him and were getting ready to put him to death, actually burn him at stake, a kindly priest asked him, well, don't you want to be baptized? That way you'll go to heaven. And Hatui said, are there Spanish in heaven? I don't want to go anywhere where I'm going to see any more Spanish. And so basically, Fidel answered that, and now Cuba is imperialist free, but are still subject to those sanctions that are taking such damage. But so we need to bear that in mind, I think, and I'd like to remind everybody about that. And if you want to know more about our Marxist library and about the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, I can give that later on, or come back next week and you'll hear it for sure. So with that, I want to move over and say we're very fortunate in having Larry speak today on the ways that Cuba, socialist Cuba, has dealt with COVID-19, because that's very important. And I hope we'll talk about how Cuba has dealt with so many other problems. But Larry is really, I think, needs no real introduction because he's well known. He was one of the first people that I met when I escaped from LA and moved back to the Bay Area and found my way to the Marxist library. I found Larry there, and I think he was one of the founding members of the Institute for the Critical Society. He's been here as long as I have anyway. And he exemplifies, I think, what the Marxist principle, that the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. And Larry has been active in both interpreting the world and being active with the struggle to support the solidarity struggle with the Cuban people. And he was involved in not only, let me just check here, he was while being the author and teaching at various universities, he was the author of 5 books. The latest is Wall Street's Think Tank. But also going back, he taught authored Rebels and Rulers, a history of California, of labor in California. And I think very much worth reading. And he's been active in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution for many decades, visited the country over 8 times. Is that right?
No, a dozen.
Dozen times. Okay, yeah.
A dozen times.
I wrote it down, but and he accompanied Pastors for Peace, the Venceremos Brigade, he'll pronounce it correctly, Global Exchange, and very active. And we always welcome Larry back here to the library. So with that, oh, the other thing I want to say before I turn it over to Larry, to Alan, is that if you appreciate the program today and share our opinion that the work of Karl Marx is going to remain as important for the class struggles of the future as it has been for the past, please tell our friends about us. We are an expanding, we've done well with Zoom and getting out to a wider audience, but I think more people need to know about us and attend our meetings. So I hope you will spread the word. And with that, I will turn it over to Alan. And sorry it took so long on all this.
Alan,
Okay,
before
yeah.
you start, I'm going to let everybody know I'm going to mute everyone except Alan and of course our speaker. So just give me a moment and I'm going to mute all. As soon as I figure out how do I do mute all at once.
There's a button on participants window.
Yeah,
Bottom.
participants window. Okay, right.
Bottom.
At the bottom. Yeah, I know participants there. Oh, mute all. Okay, thank you. I'm going to mute all and then I'll give, of course, Alan, you're a co-host, so you have to unmute yourself. And then I'll unmute Larry after that. Larry, I've asked you to unmute. So it's in your control. Should be in your control to unmute.
Okay.
Alan, you.
I'm okay.
Okay.
All set?
I guess we're ready, right?
Recording? Okay, we're recording. Oh, okay, so just a very quick description. What we're going to do is we're going to have a talk for about an hour, maybe a little bit less. Then we'll take a break for announcements and fundraising, and then come back with question and answers period afterwards. So with no further ado, let's have Larry Shoup go ahead and do your presentation.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Gene, for that nice introduction, that excellent introduction. Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My talk today is going to be in 6 parts. First, the global context. Second, U.S. context, capitalism. Third, U.S. strategy and tactics to deal with COVID-19. Fourth, Cuban context, socialism. Fifth, Cuban strategy and tactics to deal with the COVID. And then sixth, conclusions. And I'm going to start with a quote from Antonio Gramsci, Prison Notebooks. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. So for my first segment is global context, catastrophic capitalism. I'm not on the screen though, you might want to put me on the screen instead of Raj.
We see you.
I see Raj, but I don't see myself. Okay.
Okay.
First, global context, catastrophic capitalism. Humanity's world today is best characterized by focusing on the convergence of 5 major crises created by the current dominant system of catastrophic capitalism. A capitalism in decay, raising the threat of the takeover by a full-scale death system, that is, a takeover by fascism. These 5 crises, all mainly caused by catastrophic capitalism, are, first, the planetary ecological crisis. Intensifying climate change, the heating and polluting of the earth, including the oceans, tends to obliterate the very conditions required to maintain our globe as a safe place for human habitation. The accumulation of capital as an end in itself tends to break the integrity of the natural world by developing formerly wild areas. Humans must achieve a long-term sustainable relationship to natural systems or die out as a species. The second main crisis of our time is an epidemiological health crisis. It is increasingly clear that our planet's health and human health are closely connected. COVID-19 is only the latest in a series of zoonotic virus diseases like HIV, H1N1, Ebola, SARS, Zika, etc., that have jumped species as humans plow further into wild habitats, loosening viruses onto our species. Food supply chains are the links between deforestation and climate change, biodiversity loss, resilience of human immune systems in our communities. Our immediate health crisis is due to COVID-19, but not limited to this virus, since other viruses may soon appear. The entire capitalist system is ecologically destructive for profit, and it's a system of disease, destruction, and social murder. Thirdly, the current world economic crisis. There's a looming danger of another Great Depression, largely due to attempts to stop COVID-19 by shutting down economies in many parts of the world. Billions of people are impacted impacted and are now out of production via numerous national shutdowns. The fourth crisis is the complex currents of rebellion now going on in the world. Both right and left-wing sectors in many nations, often led by youth, are rebelling. The left is rebelling against systematic racism, injustice, authoritarian rule, the austerity of the capitalist system, police murder, and repression. The right is rebelling in defense of tradition over socioeconomic changes that they hate, including immigration, equality for minorities and women, and rights for sexual minorities, as well as opposition to government authority. Youth in general feels alienated, hopeless about the future for themselves, and willing to take to the streets to express their anger. The fifth crisis is the empire of chaos. The decline of US hegemony, while national capitalisms each attempt to expand their scope of exploitation, has created a world of rival imperialisms that is unstable, with a heightened risk of cold wars and hot wars. Struggles for the redivision of the world are ongoing. Looming in the background is the danger of miscalculation and full-scale war between medium-sized or large-sized powers, with possibly catastrophic results. China versus the US in a new Cold War is the headliner, but many other conflicts are ongoing. Just to cite one, Greece and Turkey are conflicting over the Mediterranean and whether they can get resources, economic resources, gas and oil in the Mediterranean. Altogether, in sum, this suite of reinforcing crises is the biggest in our lifetimes and likely to eventually be as large or larger than the events of the Great Depression and World War II. The COVID-19 pandemic will be remembered as a key event in world history. The UN Secretary General states that what we have seen so far is merely, quote, a dress rehearsal of the world challenges to come, end quote. As with any intense crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought forward and made clearer truths about the United States and the Cuban socioeconomic, political, cultural systems, and the type of leadership, ideas, and rank and file characteristics of each system. My next segment is US context, capitalism, the rule of dead labor. As Marx pointed out over 150 years ago, capitalism is a privately owned economic system based on creating commodities from the natural world with human labor and with the goal of profit, growth, and capital accumulation for a small minority of the people, the capitalists. This capital represents labor exploitation and ecological destruction. This results in the dictatorship of the capitalists with a variety of individual personifications of capital. The dominant personification of capital is, however, people with various levels of the mental illness of extreme individualism called narcissistic personality disorder. And we know who we're talking about right away now. The obvious example is Donald Trump. People with full-scale narcissistic personality disorder, like Trump, have an excessive need for admiration and a lack of empathy for other people. They desire power and exploit those around them to achieve it. They are arrogant, feel superior, and try to establish abusive relationships of power and control over others. They demean, bully, and belittle others while they feel entitled to be in charge, while they are envious and hostile towards others who are successful. This is important since capitalists, especially those who attain leadership political role, as in the case of President Trump, set the tone for what is already an individualistic, very unequal, dog-eat-dog capitalist society. Much of the larger society and culture is trained to be individualistic, narcissistic, not believing in or valuing social solidarity, equality, cooperation, or community, except to some extent within their own group. Feelings of alienation, powerlessness, and loneliness are common, which feeds into the narcissistic leader and the scapegoating of the other, those with different origins, backgrounds, and values. Capitalist individualism and competition results in a ruthlessness towards the other, not human solidarity. White supremacy, narrow nationalism, nativism, racism, and class privilege are rampant in the United States. And it starts at the top. The result is a sick society with tendencies towards fascism. Capitalism and healthcare. Since capital accumulation for those already rich is the main societal goal, good healthcare for all, including public health, is not a priority. Rather, the goal of the capitalist healthcare system is to make a profit for the capitalists. So drug prices are high, insurance premiums are high, doctors and hospitals are expensive, with just enough facilities, no extra for a crisis, but just enough to meet the current need, and money is invested to solve rich people's problems, not to take care of poor and working class people. This has resulted in several healthcare systems in the United States. One for the wealthy, which in the case of top government employees like Trump and the military, amounts to socialized medicine for the rich. Another for professionals and better paid workers. Another for lower paid workers. And yet another called emergency care, quote unquote, for the outcasts, poor people who are majority Black, Brown, and Native American. So those at the bottom of the race class capitalist system, the hierarchy, bottom of the hierarchy, are those under more stress, they're less healthful, and die at a much higher rate during a pandemic, and at younger ages than the rest of the population, even in normal times. In addition, many people in the United States have health insurance through their job. So when they lose their job, they lose their health care. Obviously, this is a big problem in the pandemic. Another problem is the decentralized nature of the US healthcare system. Because they often have to serve people who cannot pay, US hospitals are now often shutting down. In the last year alone, for example, 3 hospitals in the African-American neighborhoods in Chicago have closed because they couldn't afford to treat so many poor people. People will die as a result of this. Political results. America's secret is now out. The USA is not exceptional or superior. After many decades of boastful declarations amplified by Trump, US politics is obviously a macabre shadow of its former self. US democracy, quote unquote, is in freefall. Polls tell part of the story. In one recent poll, only 16% of the world's people trust Trump to do the correct thing. Germany's Angela Merkel got a 76% trust rating in the same poll. US got 16, Germany got 76. Thus, Germany is now the world's upholder of democracy, whereas the US is becoming the upholder of the trend towards fascism. Foreigners are shocked by US police brutality and murders, Republican attempts to prevent people from voting, incitement to armed and violent vigilantes, declines in life expectancy, high crimes and incarceration rates, lack of health care, and second-rate infrastructure. It is a measure of the USA's declining political expectations that the alternative, quote unquote, to Trump is Joe Biden, a 77-year-old well past his prime, a far cry from much younger and dynamic politicians of the past, to cite JFK as but one example. Biden obviously doesn't represent hope. Rather, he represents the ruling class, capitalist class's version of damage control, stop the bleeding, while still keeping the left out of power or influence. In addition, the first presidential debate witnessed a new low in American politics and political culture. Trump's behavior foreshadows a likely serious constitutional crisis in the November 2020 to January 2021 period, when Trump might refuse to leave office if defeated. This very possibility will be the most serious constitutional crisis since the 1865 years of civil war. Leadership decadence is now one of the central problems of the US system. This crisis will likely have to be solved through as big a general strike and nonviolent direct action as the American people can muster. We should all be ready to be in the streets on Wednesday, November 4th for a warning strike, and again in January to force Trump to leave office. Some retired military officers at the lieutenant colonel level have even called for the military to remove Trump if he refuses to leave office. But military commanders are not on board with this, and it will be likely strikes and other street actions will be needed to force the situation. The third section is U.S. strategy and tactics on the COVID-19 crisis. The nature of COVID-19 is that it is easily spread even by people without any symptoms. It is deadly or debilitating to many, especially the aged, those with pre-existing conditions, and those who live in disadvantaged circumstances due to a racist capitalist class society. This means that COVID-19 is best controlled by worldwide comprehensive science-based planning and action, a program serving all of humanity at an early point in the onset of the pandemic. Since humanity is not that well organized now, the next best thing is that the level of strategy and tactics is a national program in each country. The fragmentary and mostly private US healthcare system designed to make profit is not set up to respond well in a pandemic situation. The public health component is weak. Anything approaching an adequate response required strong federal intervention. Instead, bug passing took place. The Trump-led federal government instructed the states and cities to take care of the COVID-19 crisis, fragmenting things yet further. One theory as to why this was done is that Trump and the Republicans cynically believe that Democratic leaders in blue states and cities, the first to be hit by the COVID-19, because they're more interconnected with the rest of the world, would get blamed for mass sickness and death. The local authorities would, and state authorities, if they had that responsibility. So no real federal coordinated and massive response took place. Large sums of money with Democratic Party help was later shoveled out to try to deal with some of the effects of the crisis. But this was late, after wide spreading of the virus had already taken place. So the US strategic and tactical response took place on the state, city, and county level with many different responses and programs being tried and implemented. Some of these have been complete failures, some partial failures, but none fully adequate because a scientific, unified, and massive federal response at an early date was required due to the nature of COVID-19. The Bay Area in Northern California, with its higher level of consciousness, has done better than most places. But there's also examples of negligence, like transferring COVID-19 infected prisoners into San Quentin to cause an outbreak among prisoners who were locked down. The role of Trump has been criminally negligent, to put it mildly. A Cornell University study of 38 million media mentions about the pandemic concluded that Trump is, quote, the world's largest source of misinformation about COVID-19. He has argued it's under control, it will just disappear, etc. He has constantly contradicted advice by even the public health experts he himself selected about how to best control the spread of the virus. His buffoon-like what me worry approach has even resulted in him and those around him ridiculing those who wear masks, with the predictable result of a mass virus outbreak at the White House itself. This amounts to social murder on a vast scale. Trump's main credential to become president was his ability to give voice to the anger and hate at large in a sick capitalist society. He is now like a mass shooter, spraying bullets of COVID-19 at the people than accidentally shooting himself. Only he has the best of free socialized medical treatments available, whereas his millions of victims do not. The result so far is over 7.5 million COVID-19 cases in the United States and over 214,000 deaths in this country. Individual US culture has made it easy for Trump to mislead people about COVID-19 and downplay the threat and what is required to meet the danger. In contrast, socialist Cuba represents a beautiful example of how to respond to this pandemic. Cuban context, that's my next section, section 4, Cuban context, a system of life, socialism, the rule of living labor. The key basics of socialism, as outlined by Marx and Engels, and in Cuba, reinforced by Che Guevara, include the following. Not a fair division of the capitalist pie, rather a qualitatively different kind of society based on the rule of the workers, by the workers, for the workers, moving from each according to their work to each according to the need, a continuous struggle for the society of equals, permanent revolution with freely associated labor, serving human need and fostering human development. These are the goals. The free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. A system based on science, collective ownership, full democracy, and an end to capitalist dictatorship, moving towards the withering away of the state and towards the community of the associated producers. White supremacy, racism, sexism, homophobia opposed and overcome. Nature preserved and valued for its own sake. Socialism seeks to make the emancipatory project irreversible by promoting an organic system that meets human and societal needs. Socialism fosters creativity, freedom, cooperation, collective action, altruism, connectedness, solidarity, decommodification, and a collectivist ethos. A utopian view, but such a society, imperfect, but constantly improving, actually exists on this earth. It's called Cuba. And now I want to go into the characteristics of Cuban socialism, and I know about this from being up close to it and trying to be in solidarity for a long time. I first went to Cuba in 1989, but I became interested in Cuba. I didn't grow up a revolutionary. I wasn't a red diaper baby. I grew up in a reactionary Southern California town. As a matter of fact, our congressman was a John Birch Society member. So I didn't start out being a leftist. I came to it later through education and through activity. But a turning point in my knowledge of Cuba came in 1975 when the South African army invaded Angola, because Angola had just liberated itself from the Portuguese colonialism. And Angola put out the call for people to help them because South African armed forces were trying to create apartheid in Angola, invading Angola. And I'd been in the Peace Corps in the late 60s, and I knew how Africans felt about apartheid. Obviously, they hated it to their core, but the only country that came to their aid was Cuba. And they didn't send the armed forces of Cuba. Fidel went around the island after he got this call from Angola to help. He went around the island and asked the Cuban people, do you want to help Angola? Where if we have to sacrifice, Cubans may die if we go to help, or they're going to die if they go to help Angola. Do we want to do this? And the Cuban people, Fidel went around and made speeches and talked to people and interviewed them. And they said, yes, of course. Give us guns, we'll go to Angola and we'll help the Angolan people. So Cuba stayed in Angola till 1988, including fighting at another South African invasion at Cuno-Cotivale in southern Angola in 1987-88, the biggest battle in the history of Africa. And the South African army was defeated by the Angolans, the SWAPO freedom fighters, and the Cubans. And then, of course, South Africa had to sue for peace, and Nelson Mandela got out of jail. And the first place he went was Cuba. The United States was angry, said, why'd you go to Cuba? And Angola said, Cuba gave us everything, and you gave us nothing except the South African invasion. So Cuba inspired me that way, and I became active in Cuban solidarity, as Jean has mentioned. But one thing we need to understand first about Cuba is the disinformation campaign against Cuba has been one of the most extensive in world history, probably the biggest in world history. It's hard to get the truth out, but facts and personal experience can help. The Cuban Revolution is something new in the world and has not got the attention it deserves. It developed out of the unique experiences of the Cuban people in its own revolutionary history, dating back to slave rebellions and even the rebellions of the native people hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It is still imperfect, but is constantly striving to improve. It is a revolution in motion, and there's a book by ICSS, a Canadian, about Cuba that's very good, and it's called A Revolution in Motion. It's a permanent revolution. It tries to improve constantly. It's a process. You have to understand the Cuban Revolution as a process. It's not a fixed thing or an entity. It's ongoing. It represents a positive and sustainable model of human development, a collective community where the main means of production and resources have been taken over by the workers and the benefits socialized, a humane, anti-capitalist society and anti-imperialist society characterized by solidarity for all. Through education, organization, participation, free healthcare, and full employment, people in Cuba are empowered to develop their human potential and make their lives meaningful. Cubans are inspired by the example of their historic leaders, Jose Marti, Che Guevara, and Fidel Castro, as well as others, to be the new socialist men and women who follow high moral and ethical values, moral, not material incentives. Che especially stressed voluntarism, solidarity, and altruism. As he expressed it, and this is a quote from Che Guevara, without the moral factor, there is no revolution. So that's a big part of the Cuban Revolution is morality and ethics. This is embedded in Cuban popular culture, this voluntarism. For example, the Silvio Rodriguez song, Domingo Rojo, Red Sunday, which celebrates the voluntary labor for the welfare of all on Sundays that Cuba engages in periodically, did especially early in the revolution. Socialist democracy in Cuba is based on four things. First, economic equality. Due to a lack of resources and the strict US blockade, goods are often scarce and salaries are low, but many things like education and healthcare are free to all and equality rules. The second important principle of Cuban democracy is mass political participation. The revolution stays close to and responsive to the Cuban people. Island-wide meetings, tens of thousands of them, involving millions of Cubans, are held to make major political economic decisions. For example, in 2008, there was a proposal to raise the retirement age from 60 to 65 for men and from 55 to 60 for women. Yes, women have a lower retirement age in Cuba. Now, you would think that people wouldn't want to raise their retirement age. But they went to the people, and they had 85,301 meetings attended by over 3 million Cubans. These meetings were organized, 85,301 meetings. It's pretty amazing. Organized by the labor movement to discuss and vote on this change. Only a small number voted no, and the change was made. They increased their retirement age 5 years, up to 65 for men and 60 for women. To be a member of the Communist Party, and it's interesting, we could talk more about the Communist Party, it stays behind the scenes, but there are 700,000 members, the last figure I saw, in the Communist Party of Cuba, but you have to be elected by your workplace organization. It's not self-sustaining or chosen by people in the party. It's elected by workplace organizations based on the work and the contribution to society of that individual. They also have elections in Cuba. Now, a lot of Americans would never, elections in Cuba, what? And of course, they've had elections in Cuba for a number of decades. And these elections include elections for lay judges, that is, rank and file judges. They don't just have lawyers and experts as judges. They have lay judges, even on the Supreme Court of Cuba. There's lay judges. And they start, these elections start with nominations by local mass meetings. 2 to 8 candidates must be chosen. Their biographies are posted and the winners must receive 50% or there is a runoff. There's no other advertising allowed other than posting your biography for people running for office in Cuba. And children guard the ballot boxes in Cuba. Third main point of the Cuban Revolution is the merging of civil and political society. There's a gradual withering away of the state is now taking place in Cuba. That's a surprise, I think, to a lot of people, and we can talk about that. But the state bureaucracy is seen by many Cubans as a danger to full democracy, but it's kept honest through many channels. A leading channel or leading aspect of this are the mass organizations and their elected leadership. They have a lot of mass organizations in Cuba, and they elect their own leadership. These are the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, the Women's Federation, the Workers' Federation, the Students' Federation, the Artists and Writers Federation, the Farmers' Federation, and there's others. These organizations advise the government and wield a lot of authority. Revisions to the family code, just to cite one example, anything that affects people and farmers, if they're going to have something that affects farmers, the Farmers Federation is going to be involved in the decision. In the case of the family code, the Women's Federation drafted the new family code. There's a constant striving for consensus in the society of the producers, that is Cuba. The fourth aspect are these elected representatives. These elected representatives are mandated to listen to and respond to the public's critiques and suggestions. They are supposed to go out and have meetings with the people and listen to their complaints. The empowerment of women is a major achievement of the revolution. Women have equal rights and equal pay by law. Maternity leave is 12 months, and her job is protected by law. The majority of professionals in Cuba are women, as are the majority of the members of parliament. Women are in full control of their sexual and reproductive health. Birth control and abortion are free. The family code mandates men to do housework. Enforcing that, of course, might be a different question, but it's mandated by law. So women do have a chance to try to enforce that in the home. Cuban healthcare system is my next topic. Like so many things in Cuba, its healthcare system, devised by the doctors and nurses themselves, this wasn't mandated by the bureaucracy or the Communist Party or Fidel. It was organized and planned and figured out by the doctors and nurses themselves, and it's unique in the world, and it's very effective. Its results are impressive. More impressive on their own, more so given that Cuba is a poor nation, blockaded and constantly attacked by the most powerful nation the world has ever known. Cuba has Latin America's highest longevity, lowest infant, child, and maternal mortality rates, and is widely judged to have the best healthcare system in Latin America. This is a judgment, for example, by the Pan American Health Organization. Free health, community-oriented, free preventative care for everyone in Cuba begins with a family doctor generalist who serves a few hundred families from a neighborhood-based clinic where the doctor also lived. And this is the plan that was developed by the doctors and nurses. So if you lived in Cuba, your primary care physician would be present nearby. The doctor, most often a she, the majority of the physicians are women, has a responsibility to look after and actually actively promote the health of his or her families, keeping records, giving vaccinations and tests. Often the doctor with a nurse takes care of clinic visits in the morning and makes house calls as needed in the afternoon. The family doctor system was invented, as I mentioned, by the Cuban doctors themselves. It's backed up by hundreds of polyclinics and a smaller number of large hospitals, all of which are fully equipped and have the medical specialists needed to handle more complex cases. Since at least 2005, Cuba has had the best ratio of doctors to population in the entire world, with almost 3 times as many doctors per 100,000 people as in the United States, for example. That is 3 times as many doctors per 100,000 people as the US. Cuba also has the largest medical university in the world, the Latin American School of Medicine called ELAM, founded in 1999. This medical school has tens of thousands of students from 110 different nations. All attend free on scholarships from the Cuban government and the Cuban people. ELAM is fully accredited by the Medical Board of the state of California, which has some of the strictest of US standards. Students at first came only from Latin America, but later enrollment was expanded to include students from Africa, Asia, and the United States itself. Those who accept these scholarships must promise to return to their home countries and work in underserved communities. For over 50 years, Cuba has also sent volunteer doctors, nurses, and other medical personnel abroad to help nations who have requested their services. Numbers have ranged as high as 30,000 healthcare workers in 68 countries in the past, but is now reported to be about 20,000 healthcare workers in 59 nations today. Cuba has regularly provided more medical personnel to the underdeveloped world than all of the G8 countries combined, saving several million lives. Another giant success of Cuba and its medical system has been Operation Miracle, which has not got the attention it's deserved, as many things relating to Cuba have not. Cuban doctors, with financial help from Venezuela, have for free conducted over 3 million eye operations for people from 36 different nations to restore their sight to the blind or visually impaired. And I went to Venezuela on a trip one time, and we got out to a remote village, and there was a woman there. Cuba was mentioned. She said, "Oh, I've been to Cuba. I was blind, and I went to Cuba, and I got my sight back." Cuban doctors took care of me. My fifth segment is Cuba and the coronavirus, the strategy and tactics of Cuba in regard to COVID-19. In January of this year, China notified the world that COVID-19 existed and was a threat. In line with the view of Cuban socialism that it has the moral obligation, quote unquote, to do everything possible to save lives, Cuba offered aid to China, including immune-boosting drugs, which they sent to China. At the same time, the Cuban medical system and government leadership organized a task force to monitor the situation and develop a nationwide plan. The full plan was in place by March 2nd. The virus arrived in Cuba a few weeks later, mid-March, brought in by Italian tourists and the cruise ship Bremer. This cruise ship, the cruise ship Bremer, had not planned to dock in Cuba. But once it had COVID-19 outbreak on board, the US, the Bahamas, and other nations refused to allow the ship to dock at any of their ports. Desperate, they asked Cuba for help. The Bremer was accepted by Cuba on humanitarian grounds. Those who were sick were taken to Cuban hospitals. Those well enough to travel were taken to Jose Marti International Airport in Havana and flown home on charter flights. With the virus loose in Cuba, the public health sector swung into action. Tourism was shut down. Those tourists already in Cuba, 40,000 people according to one report, could go home or stay in Cuba as they wished. The Cuban strategic plan was to organize a massive preventative effort to keep the virus at the local spread level, where it could be traced and controlled, and prevent the progression to the community spread level, where it's spreading out of control. Of course, the US failed to keep the virus to the local spread level, and so we see the serious consequences of that we're now seeing. To prevent the spread, all nightclubs, cinemas, gyms, etc. were shut down. All workplaces and schools were immediately required to provide hand-washing stations at multiple and convenient places. Later, many schools were temporarily closed. 444 points of distribution of chlorine solution to clean were rapidly set up nationwide. Food markets were altered so you wouldn't have crowding. The methods of distribution were decentralized by using mobile street sellers with carts who went into the neighborhoods to serve the people's needs. Well organized. Tables at restaurants and cafeterias were ordered to practice social distancing. 151 workshops nationwide, which had mainly been making school uniforms, were reorganized to make masks for the entire population. By mid-April of this year, Cuba had an ample supply of masks, and the population was being educated about the need to wear them. To identify and trace the contacts, testing kits were distributed, and about 30,000 medical students and volunteers from the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution were tasked with going door to door around the whole island to rapidly screen the entire population for fever and other symptoms. They referred any discoveries to the local family doctor for testing, quarantining, and hospitalization if necessary. Contact tracing was carried out to discover who else had been exposed to the virus, so appropriate measures could be taken. To minimize spread, work patterns were changed for medical personnel. Doctors and nurses now work with COVID patients at a hospital for 15 days straight, not going home, and instead staying overnight at the small hotels that are attached to each hospital. Each hospital always has had a small hotel attached to it. Now they stay there for 15 days, the medical personnel. They're tested, then they spend another 15 days at a different location. They're tested again, then they can return to their home for 15 days. They are then tested again before returning for another tour of duty at the hospital. This prevents hospital staff from getting and spreading the virus to their families and others. This policy and others are the result of ideas generated by the regular consultative meetings among the doctors and nurses themselves, a participatory society where everyone's ideas are valued and they have meetings to figure out what they should be doing. Cuban internationalism has also been play in this virus, in confronting the virus. Over 2,000 Cuban doctors and nurses have responded to requests from 23 different countries, including Italy, to send help to overwhelmed healthcare systems in these countries. The 25 brigades are named for Henry Reeves. Henry Reeves was a US citizen who volunteered and fought for 7 years in the Cuban Liberation Army against the Spanish colonialism during the 19th century. He was a US citizen. They named these brigades for a US citizen, but that citizen fought for the Cuban liberation in the 19th century. Finally, over the years, scientists at Cuba's Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology have developed 22 different antiviral drugs that can be used to help prevent infection or help recover from the coronavirus, including interferon alpha 2B, which is now becoming a famous one because it's effective. A nasal version of this drug has been given to 20,000 high-risk Cubans, including healthcare workers. Cuban scientists are also working on a vaccine for COVID, and Cuba has joined the Worldwide Vaccine Alliance, committing to, with over 70 other nations, committing to produce and equitably distribute a vaccine for all the world. Equal access for everyone is a key to defeating the COVID-19 pandemic. Tellingly, and unfortunately, the United States of America has so far refused to join the Vaccine Alliance, raising the concern that any vaccine developed by the United States will not be shared with poorer and less developed nations and peoples. Another disaster if that happens. Conclusions. Due to 60 years of building a society of, by, and for all the people, a solidarity society to fulfill human needs and human development, Cuban socialism was able to formulate and implement a credible, coherent, scientific, rational, and ethical plan to empower the Cuban people to successfully defeat COVID-19. As of October 9th, 2 days ago, Cuba has only 123 fatalities from this virus. 123. In contrast, the US has had over 214,000 fatalities. This is capitalist social murder on a vast scale, what the US has done under Trump. Contrary to the propaganda of the United States, World Bank, IMF, and multinational corporations, profits and accumulating wealth for the few does not foster health. Growth that increases inequality is anti-health. The virus has shown that a country's character matters and that a collectivist socialist ethos is far stronger and more successful than capitalist individualism. In reality, health outcomes depend upon ecosystem stability and social and cultural development broadly defined. Education, housing, participation, unalienated employment, equality, good nutrition, social solidarity, organized health promotion, clean air and water, competent and empathetic leadership, altruism, and morality. The lack of these in the United States of America, and the results are obvious. Cuba's socialist experiment has a lot to say about what a genuine democracy looks like and about the model of a sustainable human development that is urgently needed by humanity and the ecosystems of the world. As a revolution of world historical significance, Cuba can offer us a vision of a different future for humanity. As it becomes increasingly clear that capitalism is an unviable system, putting humanity on the road to extinction, revolutionary ideas can become a material force for a new world. Another world is possible. As the Reverend Lucius Walker, the leader of numerous material aid caravans to Cuba, expressed it, quote, "The world needs Cuba." Thank you for your attention, your kind attention. I will be happy to respond to questions and comments after our break.
Thank you, Larry. Great presentation. What we're going to do now is take a short break for announcements and fundraising. And I'll turn it over to Jean. Let's take a short one. And then when we come back, we'll open it up for questions and answers from the audience. So, Jean?
Okay, well, thank you, Larry. Again, you kind of blow us away with what's going on in Cuba. And so people have a little chance to mull this over and think about what questions and comments they want to make. Let me kind of go over some of our upcoming programs, because I think we have a good set of things coming up. First of all, next Monday, we made some adjustments over the weekend. So on Monday, we're still working on how to adjust. I mean, next Sunday, October 18th, we're still working on that program, but we will make a final decision at our program committee meeting tomorrow. So we'll know that within a few days. But on October 25th, we're going to deal with the attack on anti-racist organizers in Denver. As many of you know, there was a coordinated police attack in which protest leaders, including 4 members of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, were arrested in a coordinated police attack, charged with over 30 bogus charges, including kidnapping and inciting a riot with a potential of years in prison. So we'll deal with that. And then moving on, November 1st, we have our comrade Wadia Halabi from Boston talking about the fall of the Soviet Union and new insights into what happened in 1917 as well as 1989. So that will be excellent. November 8th, which will be the first Sunday after the election, and nobody knows what's going to happen. So we've titled that, What Now? And we'll look about the various responses. Do we dump Trump or battle Biden? So that'll be the question we will address. And Gloria La Riva, who's the presidential candidate of PSL, will join us. Moving on, we have Rick Sterling, November 5th on Syria, Stanfield Smith on how the US dominates the world economy, our comrade from India, Abhinav Sinha, spoken here before on the international working class and other things. So again, stick with us and tell your friends about us, because I think the word we're trying to spread is something very important. And of course, this doesn't come free, although we're a grassroots organization and we are flourishing with your support. Let me turn it over to our Chief Financial Officer, or our Treasurer, Richard Fallenbaum.
Thank
Richard,
you.
there?
Thank you, Gene. I won't say anything more about the Sunday programs and how important they are. I just want to remind you that it does cost us some money to put these programs together, and I hope they're useful to you. You can find the information on making a contribution on the chat, and you can even do it during the question and answer, so you won't waste time. You'll have the sound in the background. Get onto PayPal if you use it, and just send us some money. Be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Can I just throw in one more thing on that? that, again, we're meeting on Zoom, which is not as expensive, but we pay $50 a week, or 75 actually, to the Marxist Library. And even though we're not meeting there, we're continuing to support the library with that financial support because they're a crucial institution and definitely worth our support. So I just want to point it out, Zoom in some ways is cheaper, but we still have, we feel a obligation to support the library. So, and I hope you will also. So back to you, Alan.
Okay, so we're going to open this up now for questions from the audience. And the way that we do this is if you would look at the participants window, if you click on the participants icon at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see your name listed. You can raise your hand if you move the mouse over your name, and we will call people in order, and we will give 2 minutes for every questioner to make their question or make a quick statement, and turn it back over to Larry to respond. So I'm going to start with Laura and then Yusuf. And do go ahead and raise your hand if you have any questions or wish to say anything. And Raj, will you be doing the timing?
I will, and I will raise my hand if it approaches 2 minutes, so keep an eye on my hand when it's raised.
Okay, great, thanks. So Laura, if you would go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Larry. And it was great to hear all that about Cuba. One of the questions that I have is that I know one of the many criticisms that people have made of Cuba is they say, well, they're the Castro brothers, and what are they going to do after the Castro brothers? As if Cuba would never, consider such a possibility. And so I wonder, do you know anything about how the transition happened? I just looked up Miguel Diaz-Canel has been there a year yesterday, was when he became president. And I wonder if you know how that process worked. Thank you.
I'm not that knowledgeable to say exactly how that worked, but all these leaders of Cuba are all elected, within their electoral system. And then, they probably the parliament had something to do with it. I'm just not sure, but it's always been said that, first when Fidel goes, the revolution's over, and when Raul goes, and then they said because Raul took over, and Raul has been the partner of Fidel since, very, very long time ago. They were fighting when Raul was only 17. They were fighting in the mountains. He and Fidel were fighting in the mountains. He was only 17 years old, so it wasn't illogical for him to take over, even though he was the brother. But they always said, well, then once the Castro brothers are out, then revolution will collapse. And every Cuban I've always, that I've always, talked to about it, have all said, we have many leaders. It's not a problem. Plus, we're a very active, participatory society. And we're not going to tolerate a bad leader. It's a revolutionary society. And the people, frankly, they like to complain. And they always complain about various things, but they're still 100% for the revolution. Even though they complain, they see a lot of shortcomings all the time. And they're openly complaining to foreigners or to themselves and each other. So it's a open society that way. And the fact that this new leader has handled this, not that he handled it, it was the people that handled it. That the thing has gone so well, and the COVID, one of the best in the world. There's some other countries have done very well too, but Cuba is one of the best in the world as far as dealing with this. It's gone without either of the Castros in charge. So it just shows the truth of what people saying from a very early date. What happens when Fidel leaves? Then what happens when Raul leaves? What happens is the revolution continues because it's very strong among the people. It's going to be a permanent revolution, I think. Unlike the ones we've seen who've fallen by the wayside, they had their own problems that resulted in the destruction of the revolution. Anyway, that's the best answer I can give because I really don't know the details. Thanks for the question, though.
Okay, again, I would encourage people to raise your hand, go to the participants window, hover over your name and click on raise hand if you have a question. Next is Yusuf, followed by Richard. So Yusuf, if you would go ahead.
Well, I think you gave me a hint about the answer to this question, but I'd like you to elaborate a little more, and I hope that Wadi will also touch on this question. As you know, there's a very harsh illegal blockade on Cuba, and the consequences of which was made much worse when the Soviet bloc collapsed. But yet, it was the Soviet bloc that collapsed, and Cuba survived, socialism survived, the Communist Party of Cuba survived. So could you elaborate on the reasons why socialism and the revolutionary leadership survived in Cuba, and under much less harsh conditions, socialism collapsed in most other socialist countries?
Yeah, well, I think the reason is because the Cuban Revolution has always stayed close to the people. Its whole purpose has been to respond to the people's needs. And it really is a workers' society. I've been in some Cuban factories, for example, and whereas in the Soviet Union, some of the Soviet people used to say, well, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. And I think in Cuba, you have uneven work. There's some people who don't work very hard because there's not a lot of pressure on them to work hard. But other people, under the inspiration of Cuban leaders like Che Guevara and Fidel and Raul and others, and Jose Marti going way back, they're inspired to work very hard. So you have uneven work, but people feel very strongly that this is their society, their country. And the United States has been, for good reason, afraid to intervene, to try to invade Cuba, because it would be a complete disaster for them. I remember seeing a poster on a wall during the special period when the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba was in very difficult circumstances. It was a picture of Fidel holding an AK-47, and the subtitle was that this was a poster that was put up around Cuba, and he was holding an AK-47 because Bush was threatening, to invade. They were flush with success after overthrowing Saddam Hussein. They were maybe going to invade, and it said, each Cuban an army, every Cuban an army. And that you see signs of that all over the island. They're they love the revolution, even though they might complain bitterly about some aspects of it. They love the revolution and they're very supportive. And just the rank and file, think of the solidarity among the people. I heard the story of people on a bus in Havana, and there was a crowded bus. Oftentimes there are crowded buses because they don't have enough buses. Oftentimes, the U.S. blockade has made things very difficult for them. Anyway, there was an empty seat, and an Afro-Cuban man sat down in the seat. And one older woman actually said, he would have to get it. And people on the bus yelled to the driver, stop the bus, stop the bus. We have a racist on our bus. They started lecturing him. We made a revolution. A lot of people died to end this racism. We don't want any of it. Get off the bus. That's the Cuban people. They are strongly egalitarian, strongly everyone, all for one and one for all. And they're voluntaristic, and they strongly support the revolution. I don't think you had that same thing in the Soviet Union. It had, I think, my view is, it had deteriorated into too much bureaucracy, too much control from above, and not enough rank and file participation. In Cuba, you have rank and file participation. Part of this is inspired by Che Guevara, because for a time, the Cubans were following a lot of Soviet aspects of the Soviet system, but they had a rectification program in the 1980s. In the 70s, they were more along the lines of the Soviet system. Then in the 1980s, they had a rectification system where they tried to decentralize things, get things back to more power of the people, and that's been very successful, I think. They just change things when they need to. They had centralized factories, then they developed more workshops where you had more local control. They had state farms, now you have more cooperative farms where the farmers themselves run things. You had these bigger state farms, then now you have more small farmers. So they're just closer to the people and responsive to the people, and this has made them, I think, and invulnerable to try to be overthrown because people like the revolution. They don't want to. In fact, Cubans are kind of surprised when you tell them, well, in the United States, everybody doesn't have health care. They're like dumbfounded. What? How could that be? Everyone deserves having full health care. They're just kind of really surprised. So it's a system that's really strongly supported by the people. And I think that's the difference. The history, of course, is part of it too. Here's a society that had slavery, in the 1860s, even the 1870s. It wasn't overthrown till then. And it was the people that organized. It was some of the leaders of that 19th century Cuban society that freed their slaves and told the slaves, join the Army of Liberation against the Spanish. So they have this long history of fighting for freedom, which culminated in the revolution of the 1950s and Fidel taking power with this revolution. So I think there's just a lot of differences between Cuba and the Soviet Union.
Okay.
Hope that answers your question adequately.
I want to encourage people to raise your hand if you have any questions, chime in. Next questioner will be Richard, followed by Jean, and then Roger. So Richard, right?
You somewhat anticipated my question. I've noticed lately in my readings that a lot of, in particular in China, that a lot of the healthcare came down to the neighborhood issues. And I guess my question is, can you compare at all? Here democracy is very much about voting.
Yeah.
And once you've done voting, that's it. Everything goes away.
Yeah, right.
It strikes me that in these communist or socialist countries, the democracy is much more at the neighborhood level. And for example, apparently China, the neighborhood councils in China went around on a daily basis checking on people's health, monitoring the temperatures, finding out if they had any illnesses, and they went door to door, and it was all organized at the neighborhood level. I think you said essentially the same kind of thing for Cuba. That a lot of it comes down to neighborhood level organizations. I see the same thing happening in Venezuela. There's a lot of the revolution is supported at the neighborhood level, and so I was just wondering if you could maybe address the similarities or differences of that, or am I off on a completely irrelevant tangent? Thank you.
No, I think that's a very important point, but I haven't studied China enough to really compare. And Venezuela, I was there once, but I haven't really studied it in any depth. I know that what you said about Venezuela is also partly true. And of course, you had Cuban healthcare people invited by Venezuela to go with Cuban doctors and nurses. So they did have Cubans there, which probably also influenced some of this. But certainly in Cuba, yeah, this is pretty amazing the way they've organized their healthcare system. And the fact, they had about 30,000 people going door to door all over the island early in the pandemic to identify people that needed to be quarantined or hospitalized, or just were starting to get it, and so they needed to be watched, to make sure they didn't get sicker. That is pretty amazing, I think, to do this on a whole nationwide level. I don't think China was able to do that, but they maybe did it in Wuhan, on a Wuhan province level, while they isolated to keep people from spreading it. So these are successful strategies, whereas so many countries, not just the U.S., but other right-wing countries like Brazil and India, have really it's terrible now, but it's going to be even worse as time goes on, because you have community spread of the COVID, and it's just going to it's out of control. They shutting down the economy, but that's, partially at least, but that's not going to really solve it. The key is to getting it early and getting it completely under control, and that's what they did in Cuba.
Okay, next question is Gene, followed by Roger, Michael, and then Raj.
Okay, well, thank you. And I really appreciate people's discussion on this. I would like to add something. I was only in Cuba once, and I really appreciate people who have been there more than me telling me about what's going on there. So I appreciate that. But when I was in Cuba for the 150th anniversary of the publication of the Communist Manifesto. It was a kind of conference. I remember one of the sessions, one of our North American comrades, said, well, you Cubans, you only have one party. How can you say you're a democracy? And the Cubans' response was, under Batista, we had 7 political parties and no democracy. Now we have one political party and we have democracy. And I think that's pretty generally true of all the countries in which communist parties are, they live with the dictatorship of the proletariat generally is much more democratic than bourgeois democracies. And in terms of China, if you get out your little red book, you will see on the frontispiece a picture of Mao voting in the 1953 elections. So democracy in China goes back, quite a ways, and they're very democratic. And many of the things that Larry tells us about what's going on in Cuba are also true of China and other socialist countries. I think, one of the other things I want to mention is, it's not a Cold War with China. It's a Cold War on China. And it's also, the first Cold War was a Cold War on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't want that war. It was imposed on them, just like it's imposed on China. And part of that Cold War is an ideological aspect. Massive amounts of disinformation, propaganda, not only about Cuba, but China, the Soviet Union, and so on. And
Gene, your 2 minutes are up.
Okay, I just want to say we've talked about this before, and we'll certainly talk about it again. It's one of our continuing discussions we're having at the Marcus Library.
I just have a brief comment too. The one-party idea doesn't originate with Fidel or Raul or any of the current people. It dates back to the 19th century. Jose Marti, the main leader of 19th century revolutionary Cuba, trying to free themselves from Spanish colonialism, he proposed a one-party state and a one-party country, because that's the way you could keep out imperialism. If you had more than one party, there's a tendency for imperialism to be one of the parties, is the imperialist party. So he proposed a one-party state. It goes way back in Cuba.
It's the way to go.
Okay, next question is Roger, followed by Michael K., followed by Raj.
Thank you, Larry, for your presentation. I don't think you mentioned it, or maybe you did, but I'll just mention it again, about the incredible internationalism of the Cubans. And especially in this COVID crisis, the Henry Reeve Brigade went to some 36 different countries. And there was an international campaign to award the Henry Reeve Brigade with the Nobel Peace Prize. It turned out that the Cubans did not get the Nobel Peace Prize this year. We hope that next year they will get the Nobel Peace Prize. They're very deserving it. I wanted to put the discussion a little bit more into an anti-imperialist context, because I think for us North Americans, we can't underestimate the impact of our government on the Cuban government and on the Cuban society. There is a blockade, and it's a punishing blockade, and we have a certain extreme admiration for the Cubans, and they've been heroic, but heroicism won't carry the day forever. And right now, the Cubans are in a terribly difficult situation. They're really hanging in there by their fingernails. There is almost no petroleum in the country, and what that means right now is that agriculture is now almost at a standstill. Transportation is a standstill. Industry is heavily impacted. It's a very difficult situation. If you go out to the countryside, you'll see tremendous amount of fallow fields, and the fields that are being cultivated with animal power, which is not the most efficient way. So what I'm getting at is that the impact of imperialism is greater than ever, and the need for solidarity is greater than ever. The US policy is to blockade Cuba, 1, 2, to occupy Guantanamo, the most important port in Cuba, and also to do overt and covert regime change activities, such as Radio Marti. And I think we really can't be complacent about the future of Cuba, and for that matter, Bolivia.
2 minutes.
Your time's up.
I'll just finish it real quickly. And the future of Venezuela. Both of them are in very precarious situations. We already lost Bolivia, and it's important for international solidarity more than ever.
Well, I certainly agree with the need for lots of international solidarity more. They've opened, Cuba did cut off tourism due to the COVID-19, but now they're starting back opening up tourism for some places in Cuba, not Havana. Havana still has to be quarantined, or not allowed to open up for tourism, and a couple other places. But otherwise, you can fly to Cuba now. Tourism has been one of their mainstays to keep the country going, of course, because of the blockade being hard on them and lack of resources, etc., and giving so much to the people. All the free things, free education, free healthcare, full employment, subsidies for food, etc. It's difficult to maintain that. But I think you've painted a picture that's partly true. I'm not sure it's quite as dire as you say. Maybe you're more up to date on it than I am, but it's been serious for a long time. The special period was very serious for when the Soviet Union collapsed. And they lost 80% of their inputs in a period of just a few months. So that was very serious. That lasted for several years, but Cuba came out the other side successful. So these are very creative, hardworking, intelligent people. The need for solidarity, I agree with 100%. And the dangers of imperialism, I agree with what you're saying, of course. But I wouldn't be quite as dire about their situation as you are. It's tough, but I think Cuba has been able to cope, and more solidarity, the better. If anyone can travel to Cuba on a vacation, go. There's no reason why you can't. You can fly from lots of places. You can fly to Cancun and fly into Cuba. You can, the last time I went to Cuba a few years ago, you could fly from Los Angeles. But when I was taking in material aid with John Mirko to the hospitals, we used to go to the border at the Mexican border at Tijuana and fly from Tijuana. So there's lots of ways you can go to Cuba, and they would appreciate going there and giving them some money for foreign exchange.
Okay, next is Michael K, followed by Raj. And again, if you have a question, please go in participants window, raise your hand. And Michael.
Yes, I'm going to let my partner, Susan S, ask her question.
Larry, my question is a little bit related to Roger's. I have talked with friends who've been in Cuba in the last year and a half, and they notice among young people a certain impatience and ennui. And the same friends were in Vietnam in the same period of time and noticed the same thing. So this is the general question is, how do revolutionary societies keep going with next generations? Yeah.
That's a pretty tough question. I don't feel very capable to answer that. I haven't been to Cuba for 3 years or so, and my contacts in Cuba have been more older people, and I haven't been that much in touch with Cuban young people. It's not surprising because the cultural influences worldwide are towards, capitalism has an advantage in the sense of people want material goods, and they want, more media, and they're less, when they're young, they're more influenced by these things. But I think that the Cuban educational system is very important to maintain the revolution. That's one of the bases of the revolution. The educators that I've talked to in Cuba see themselves as one of the key bases of the revolution. And so that's a way to sustain it, I think, is education. And the general culture, of course, I don't see the revolution as being overthrown by the young people. There is a lot of dissatisfaction. What could be, that doesn't seem surprising when you have the most powerful nation in the history of the world constantly trying to overthrow them any way they can. That makes it difficult, and they lack, some material goods, and so that's part of it. So it's a difficult situation, I agree, and there is some changes going on that are negative, but overall, my impression is the Cuban people will prevail and the revolution will continue. Certainly, it's overcome some very difficult moments in the past, and there's been a book written about that called Children of Che, and maybe that has become less important now. The book came out some years ago, and it was talking about Cuban education and the children that were coming out of the educational system of Cuba at that time, and they were strong revolutionaries. So it's hard to say what's the answer for this, but those are a few thoughts that I have.
Okay, next is Raj, and raise your hand if you have any questions you want to ask. Raj, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. Larry, excellent talk. I wanted to say something about comparing Cuba with the Soviet Union that you implicitly did about participation in democratic functioning, and then invite your comment on it. My study of Soviet Union is that there was a great deal of participation up until Stalin died by the masses in the society, and their main challenge was defeating the enemy, which was imperialism's attack, and then building an economy, education, and all that. They did all that with participation. It wasn't not a non-participation. I think then it began to change because Khrushchev began to think of defeating imperialism with economy, much like what China is doing today, except Khrushchev didn't have a chance to do it and made mistakes. Now, also implicit in your commentary early on, I mean, your first opening was the world is today divided in two camps. And you said two capitalist camps. I share that with you, and I think some people on this here don't agree with that. So I think the danger is great because both are competing for markets, and there's a clash coming on control of markets. And without going into attacking any country, but I think that is a very dangerous situation for humanity. On Cuba, I just want to tell you that I happened to be in a studio 1994 in CBS studio here locally, because I was being interviewed right after this program I watched, which happened to be on Cuba. I was there for in opposition to what turned out to be the right-wing movement in India led by Modi. But there was a woman against a professor from Stanford. Stanford professor was anti-Castro, and she was describing how she got treatment for a whole year. She was going to die and had no other way of thinking, and Cuba took care of her. I have one more comment, but my time is up. So I hope I'll have another chance, and I'll come back to talk about something else, about India and the COVID, which is more topical.
Okay. David, if you would unmute and ask your question. David Campbell?
Yes, yes.
There you go.
I can.
David, are you there? It's the connection might be a problem. You're muted. Here, let me.
You're muted.
Okay, now we can hear you.
Okay, very, very good. Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Very, very good and stimulating. A twofold question. I'm wondering, though, so historically, with regards to Cuba, we hear quite a bit about Russia or the Soviet Union. I'm wondering what other countries might, certainly politically, there would be interests aligned with socialist countries. I guess I'm wondering in particular the role that China might play in modern day Cuba, or in the past, let's say, where the Soviet Union has left off, just what those relationships might look like. And then the second, I guess the final question is, I don't pretend to think that there's any ultimate or final, I won't say final, any ultimate solution with regards to the US and Cuba relationship. Does the US become more like Cuba, or Cuba more like the US and the West? Do we continue on sort of parallel but distant paths as we are, blockades and all the rest, and consider both as projects, the American project that's still evolving, the Cuba or socialist or communist project that's still evolving, and learn from each other but not become more like each other? I'm just wondering what the sort of possibilities in that regard are in terms of going forward. Thank you again.
Well, as far as China and Cuba goes, during the special period, China was, because the Soviet Union had collapsed in 1990, so did the rest of the socialist bloc. Because of that, Cuba was in a very dire circumstance, and they tried to reach out to China. And China was able to help Cuba in various ways, some loans and some things like, I know I was down there during that period, and they had a lot of bicycles, mostly bicycle parts they got from China, because they had to move away from motorized transport because they didn't have the oil. Even buses were low, the number of buses they didn't have, so they encouraged people to ride bikes for health and to get to work riding a bike instead. So China supplied bikes. So there's been a pretty long connection between China and Cuba. And of course, this, in the current Cold War developing between China and the United States, China might have an interest in getting closer to Cuba as a geopolitical aspect. Not that Cuba wants to be in the middle of these geopolitical fights, but in order to survive, they can use help from China. So that there's likely to be a closer relationship between China and Cuba as things develop. Your other, what was your other question again? I'm sorry. I forgot that.
In terms of the distance between Cuba
between
and
the U.S. and
our systems, how do we continue? How do we go forward?
You were projecting about what my speculations might be about the future, whether Cuba may become more capitalist or the United States become more socialist. Well, I don't think Cuba is a very strongly socialist country. I don't think it's going to become more capitalist, although, sometimes just like Lenin after the Civil War in 1918 to 1920 period, adopted some capitalist techniques in order to try to survive. Cuba might do that too, not as a long term, but as a short term in order to survive a difficult circumstance. And the COVID-19 has put them, because they've lost so much tourism, has put them under serious economic threat. So they might have to adopt some capitalist techniques because of that. But in the long term, I don't think Cuba is going to become a capitalist country. Its socialism has been serving the people very well. I don't think they want to go back. The U.S., it's sad, but the U.S. is a pretty strong capitalist country. We have a small left wing, cohort among ourselves and others who think like we do, but it's pretty small. We couldn't even get Bernie Sanders, a social democrat, not really a strong socialist, but a social democrat, positive. A lot of things are positive about Bernie Sanders. It would have been a very important advance if he had become the Democratic nominee. But the American ruling class, the capitalist ruling class, is extremely powerful in the United States, and they were able to sideline him and make sure that he did not become the Democratic nominee. And this is typical of the United States. So I think the U.S. is going to stay a capitalist society as it degenerates, and at some point we might be able to overthrow it and institute a different kind of society, but it's going to be difficult going for, I think, a long time.
Thank you, Mr. Shoup.
Okay, next is Gene, followed by Raj, and then Richard Wright.
Okay, well, thank you. And I am assuming no one else wants to speak because they certainly should take priority.
Go ahead, Gene.
But I do want to address this issue of the next generation. And I can't speak to Cuba, but I have been following China, helped found the Vets for Peace China work group, and have get a lot of information from these people. And the Chinese overwhelmingly, of all ages, do support their government. There's 120 million Chinese leave China and come to the United States every year. And every year there's 120 million Chinese that go back to China because they like it there. And if you talk about consumerism, it's a very important point. Xi Jinping talks about, socialism in a new era. Well, there is a new era. Now, socialism produces more wealth than China does, than capitalism does. China leads the world almost in consumerism, and there are negative aspects of that, I certainly agree. But I think that, the people of China like what's going on there. They support their government. The polls overwhelmingly say like 90% support for the government. So I think, and also Xi Jinping has instituted a lot of institutes for the study of Marxism throughout China, and telling people to study the work of Marx. So I don't worry about the future of socialism, next generation in China, and I think elsewhere. As Marx said, defects are inevitable in the transition from capitalism to socialism. And I think we see that in various countries. So I'll put myself back on the list for later on. Go ahead.
Okay.
Raj, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. About COVID-19, infections in the world, I just wanted to point out to Larry, India has the second largest number of COVID infections, and probably it is decreasing there also, the rate at which it's increasing. That rate is going down. And it will overtake United States in about a month or so if the trends continue. But I want to correct you on one thing, at least based on my understanding. They do not have community spread by and large. It's locally spread. And per capita in India, the deaths from COVID are about 75 per million. In the United States, it's 661 per million. In Cuba, it is 11 per 1 million. So Cuba has definitely performed, and India has not performed well, but still it is way lower. And I think the program under Modi is almost, I would say, proto-fascist movement which has led. But as far as this is concerned, they have not performed badly. I also wanted to say that in case of Cuba, India has, in the special periods, provided grain. And even now, even though Modi is right of center, strong relation with the United States, it is still supporting Cuba to some extent. It's probably not as strong, but under Modi, but they have not abandoned Cuba. So this is a peculiarity of our time. Just want to point that out to you.
Oh, that's interesting. And I thought it was community spread in India, but you say it's not yet community spread in India.
It's controversial. The government says it's not, and given, I think probably in the state where there is Bombay, that probably has community spread. But they have been able to block, and they have very aggressive contact tracing right from the beginning.
Oh,
so they have mobilized a lot of people. So the traditions came in the Indian healthcare system from previous governments, which have not been changed so much, although it has moved towards neoliberal healthcare system. But public health, to some extent, is still, it's sort of halfway. So it is not as bad. I mean, like United States is done better than some other smaller countries. Like Spain is worse than the United States among major, I mean, Spain is 40 million people. But United States is pretty bad. I think Brazil is higher than United States per million people deaths. So India is only 74. So it's almost 1/9 per capita number of deaths. So it is different. It's complicated. I don't want to divert the attention, but Cuba, of course, has performed greatly. But this performance is also done well in South Korea and Taiwan. So it depends on how quick they were on their feet and keeping track of what is going on around and information and mobilizing. So both communist and non-communist countries have done badly or better. And Cuba, of course, particularly because of its social system, has done exceedingly well. And I think that Vietnam is another one. Even though they have a market economy, they perform well. And China has done well from what I can see, although Chinese statistics actually is difficult for me to believe that in a country of 1.6, 1.5 billion people, they have so few deaths. So I don't know whether it's completely believable, but even if it's higher, it has done remarkably well. That's it.
Okay, next is 5513, followed by Richard. Why don't you go ahead and unmute? 5513.
That's Elazar.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Hello?
Yes,
I just need to know if I'm unmuted or not.
We can hear you.
Unmuted.
This is Elazar. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, okay, sorry. Couple of points. Larry mentions the impact of the Angola war on his own development. And I don't, my hearing is not worse than ever now. I'm going to be getting hearing aids. So if I say something that was discussed and I missed it. I apologize. But I don't believe he dealt with, Cuba, MPLA, Soviet Union are one side, but China was on the side of UNITA and South Africa in Angola. So I want to know from Larry, what I missed was what has China done with respect to Cuba to rectify that terrible position? I would call it a counter-revolutionary position, where their side lost, Cuba kicked butt, and that led to the fall of the South African apartheid regime also. I also want to mention, in addition to that question that I hope Larry can address, that in addition to the United States blockading, embargoing Cuba, and attacking it at the Bay of Pigs, they launched biological warfare against Cuba. It was during the Reagan administration. There were like 5 plagues in a year and a half. One was hemorrhagic dengue, which was not endemic to Cuba at all, nor was it brought back by the troops of Angola. That was a complete lie. It couldn't be transmitted in that way. Number 2, infectious conjunctivitis, which was targeting children so their parents would have to stay home and help damage the productive system of Cuba. Roya disease and blue cane disease, all within a short period of time, and probably done at Fort Detrick. Supposedly it stopped their stuff in '69, but I believe that's a lie. In any event, the one that's been researched the most is hemorrhagic dengue, and there are online things about it, but they are not as comprehensive as they should be. And I had a conversation with a woman whose boss was in Cuba, and they did what's called fingerprinting of DNA, where they could have determined which lab made these plagues. But he said, "Why don't you just mail it to me?" And then I yelled at her, "Are you kidding?" He just didn't want to bring it back, and never got back. So we never had absolute proof biologically, but that's about it. That's all I want to know. And I'm glad that those who defend China against U.S. imperialism are on the right side for me, and also those who defend Cuba against U.S. imperialism are on the right side of the barricades. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Elazar, for mentioning that. You know, I didn't have time in my talk to go into the long-lasting criminal behavior of the United States against Cuba. It's been crime after crime after crime, from the Eisenhower administration right down to Carter. Maybe let up a little bit on it, and Obama let up a little bit on it, but right down to Trump. That's just been one aspect of. They tried to kill Fidel something like 600 times, and all these embargoes and sabotaging Cuban trade deals with other countries, extraterritoriality actions, and these criminal gusanos, the ex-Cubans that went to the United States and came back and bombed lots of hotels to try to destroy tourism. It's just a disgusting. Elazar has mentioned one aspect of it, killing Cubans through dengue fever. Also, they poisoned somehow they put in some swine flu to try to kill off the pig population, because Cubans eat a lot of pork, try to starve Cubans that way. So it's been a pretty evil type of activity by the United States for a long time against the Cuban Revolution. And of course, why is that? They don't want the Cuban example out there. It has to be destroyed. You don't want a communist society that's popular among its people, that serves its people. That would be a wonderful thing if the rest of the world had this, so they have to try to destroy it. Now, Elazar asked about more on China. Yes, they were on the wrong side in that fight against the South African imperialism from 1975 to 1988, when the South African army was constantly attacking Angola, and the U.S. was arming and supporting a right-wing force called UNITA that China was on the wrong side of. Why that was, I think it was just part of the Cold War, where the United States was, fighting against any kind of socialist or communist country, and MPLA government was thought to be, of course it turned out not to be, a socialist type government, so it had to be overthrown, and they wanted to have a domestic group of Angolans, so they formed this UNITA right-wing terroristic organization, which was supported by South Africa and China. But as far as China trying to rectify that, I'm not sure that they've, confessed or said they were sorry for that mistake in supporting UNITA, which was part of the complex fight that was going on. It's a very complex history from 1975 to 1988, and Cuba played a wonderful role to help the Angolans defend their society against South African apartheid imperialism, which was supported by the United States, and the free Southwest Africa through the SWAPO, supporting with SWAPO, and they have an independent country now, largely because of Cuba. So I don't have anything to add on it. I don't really know if, except China did give those bicycles, and they did give other kinds of aid during the special period to Cuba. I know about that. Speaking about that, South Africa, I was lucky on the first caravan. I was one of the members of the first caravan to Cuba bringing material aid down in 1992 during the special period when Cuba was in deep trouble. Lucius Walker and his group organized this Pastors for Peace caravan, and I was part of it. They had a lot of important programs when I was down there, and one of them was to go to the Cuban Armed Forces headquarters and talk to veterans of the Angola war against South African invasion that Cuba participated in. It was really interesting. It was one of the highlights of any trip that I took to Cuba, was going and talking to those veterans. The session was led by a colonel that was there and talked to these veterans, gave their stories. It was men and women. Most of them were Afro-Cubans. Now we have to remember that Cuba is an Afro-Latin society. That is, the slaves who were liberated by the fights in the 19th century from being in slavery, have formed an important part that's called the Afro-Cuban part of society. And of course, they were some of the first volunteers, because where did their ancestors come from? They came from Angola. So Fidel is asking Afro-Cubans, if you want to keep apartheid out of Angola, you know what they're going to say. They're going to say, give us the guns and send us over there. And that was the big part of the fight of Cuba in Africa, was the Afro-Cubans. Of course, there were lots of European Cubans too. Lots of white Cubans were there fighting as well to keep Angola free from apartheid. But the Afro-Cubans made were the backbone of that struggle because they were extremely militant. And of course, Cuba trains its young people in the army for 2 years. When they turn 18, men and women are trained. So they didn't have to send their main army over they always have to worry about the US invading. If Cuba sent its main army to Angola, what could happen? The US could invade and they wouldn't have their army there to help defeat the imperialists. So they sent volunteers to Cuba, and those who were most likely to volunteer were Afro-Cubans. So that was a really great experience that I had meeting those mostly Afro-Cubans, some white, European Cubans as well, in that Armed Forces headquarters as part of the Pastors for Peace program when we were in Cuba. There was other things that happened that were just really amazing that turned me on to Cuba that I could go on and on with, but maybe I'll just mention one more thing. When the ship came in to bring our material aid, because we went to Mexico and then flew to Cuba from Mexico with the ship came and loaded our material aid and then brought it to Cuba. You always had good experiences with Pastors for Peace when they asked for volunteers. So it was late at night, the ship had come in, Fidel had come out to speak in front of Cuban people, and the Pastors for Peace caravanistas were there in the front row of the crowd where Fidel spoke to us. And then Lucius Walker said he wanted some volunteers. It's about 11:30 at night, and we're running on, for adrenaline all this time because there's so many things going on when we're in Cuba. So he wanted volunteers to help take some material aid out to the neighborhoods. So of course I volunteered, because good things always happen when you volunteer in Cuba. So I got on a bus and we followed a truck out to the neighborhood, one of the neighborhoods in Havana. And we thought we were going to have to unload all this stuff, out of this truck. No, at midnight, all kinds of Cubans came out of their houses to unload the material aid, which was going to the blind people's headquarters, which was in that neighborhood. Blind, Cubans are organized in all levels, and the blind people have their own organization and their own headquarters in Havana. So some of the material aid was going to them. All these Cubans came out of their house and unloaded. We just went inside to party. I thought we were going to have to unload this whole thing. I was tired, but we went in and had a nice party with the blind people. Another example of the participation, the mass participation, which is characteristic of the Cuban Revolution, and why I believe it will survive.
Okay, next is Richard Wright.
You alluded to this very briefly, and personally, I always thought that one of the reasons that Obama lifted the sanctions on Cuba, tried to get diplomatic relations, was because the U.S. pharmaceutical companies were interested in Cuban pharmaceuticals. And I guess, do you know anything, can you speak to anything about the pharmaceuticals industry in Cuba?
Well, it's very extensive. It was made a priority early in the revolution by the leadership and by the people. So the doctors and scientists were well funded and had a big center. And a lot of them were working extremely hard because they didn't have the personnel early in the revolution to do these, to try to invent new pharmaceuticals. U.S. imperialism was very concerned about Cuba pharmaceuticals because on the first caravan, we had to negotiate we first had a confrontation at the border with the U.S. authorities at the customs in Laredo, Texas, on the first caravan, and they finally let us go after they got some bad publicity. They could arrest us and throw us in jail for 10 years and fine us for $250,000. That was the legal penalty that we were facing. But we made an agreement, but they stole all the pharmaceuticals that we had that we were giving as material aid. So they were very concerned that the Cubans didn't get any pharmaceuticals because they have a well-developed pharmaceutical industry. So that could be a background factor. But I know also in terms of Obama's lessening, I mean, they just opened up some tourism and they didn't really stop the blockade completely under Obama, but it was lessened. It was an improvement. It was better for Cuba, and Cuba wanted that improvement. But another factor was another hat I wear in terms of my research and writing is on the Council on Foreign Relations, a very important ruling class organization in the United States that oftentimes is in the forefront of policy changes. And they, in 2015, they recommended tightening the policy towards China, being more hard-line on China. And we see the results of that. 5 years later, there's a Cold War going on almost with China. This was a Council on Foreign Relations private organization. I have a couple of books on it. They recommended this policy towards China. Well, just before Obama, just a year or so before Obama was elected, something like that, the council had a study group on Cuba, and they felt that policy was failing, and they took kind of an advanced position saying that the blockade should be lifted slightly to see if you can get Cuba to, moderate their policies, and maybe they could bring them under more U.S. influence. And so that's what they recommended, and Obama followed that policy. So it was a policy of the more sophisticated sector of the American ruling class, which Trump is only minimally connected to, for example. Biden is well connected to the Council on Foreign Relations. If he's elected, there's going to be lots of Council on Foreign Relations people in positions of power in the new administration. But this was kind of an advanced policy on the part of the council saying, well, let's see what happens if we let up a little bit on the embargo, within reason, maybe we can get Cuba to, moderate and come on our side a little bit more. Trump decided it didn't work. and overturned it. But this was the result of the more sophisticated part of the ruling class, U.S. ruling class, trying some kind of trial balloon, we could call it, to see what would happen.
Okay, we're getting close to the ending time. Let's take Yusuf and then Raj, and then Larry, I'm going to ask you at the end before we open it up to discussion to maybe make a few closing comments. So Yusuf?
Well, I actually I have a comment on the question about Cuba-Chinese relations, and I happened to go to a lecture. I would have gone if I known about it anyway. At Yale by a Cuban official. I missed the beginning, the introduction on Cuban-Chinese relations. The reason China supported UNITA, that was a time when the Sino-Soviet split was a very harsh. The US and China were getting close against the Soviet Union. Cuba was getting aid from the Soviet Union. And he remarked that although ideologically they were similar, Cuba was on the side of the Soviet Union at the time. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, things didn't matter. They opened up trade relations first. China had a policy of non-interference in non-interference and at times goodwill with the nations that traded, goodwill particularly with underdeveloped nations, and non-interference in internal affairs. So they opened up first trade, and in his words, decided that they had some many things in similar. I mean, you know, the works of Che Guevara, Fidel. They're theoretical. They're guerrilla. They're quite. They're much in common with Mao Zedong's works. They were apparently they said, well, let's bygones be bygones and develop close relations. So. It's a mutual, right now there's a mutual understanding of just forgetting the past recriminations due to the split. And as far as MPLA, well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, MPLA took a social democratic stand. It's a member of the Second International now, the gathering of social democratic parties. But still, I think the U.S. Would still rather have someone else governing Angola. So that's what I would say about the MPLA.
Okay, that's 2 minutes. Raj, did you have a question? We're almost out of time. Did you want to go ahead, Raj? You're muted, Raj. Raj, you're muted.
The volunteerism question is very important. Cuba has shown the greatest revolutionary initiative through volunteers. And I think this existed both in China and USSR. USSR for a long time, China is diminished for some reason. And China did things like siding with US and South Africa against MPLA-led government. So something changed in China starting 1970s, but USSR, I think even continue even under Khrushchev. So certain amount was there, degraded afterwards. So this is a very important question. And I think Fidel Castro has shown a path forward for socialism. Wherever there's a revolution, he has shown, so I think he has learned the lesson that others have not quite learned and had reverted back to a capitalist economics. That's all. And you can comment on that, Larry, please.
No, I don't have a comment on that.
Okay, what I'm going to do is we actually have one more person. Rich, if you want to go ahead and raise the last question, then we'll have Larry do a quick sum up at the end, okay?
Well, I just want to comment that relations between Russia and Cuba have been very warm for at least 50 years, with the exception of the Yeltsin period. They're particularly warm now. They have a great deal of cooperation. I saw a recent comment by the Russian foreign minister who referred to Cuba as the island of freedom. And of course, not only with Russia, but the countries associated with Russia, Belarus, which is under attack now, and Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan also. So, they are an example. The economic relations between those countries and of course China too are examples of socialist proletarian solidarity. That's all.
Okay, Larry, if you want to go ahead and if you have any closing remarks, then we'll stop the recording and move into open mic. So
Okay, yeah,
go ahead, Larry.
My talk was aimed at pointing out the bankruptcy of current U.S. society, and at the same time, we can be happy about the success of Cuba. We can share their success, and I think understanding why they had as much success as they did, and what, as the world deteriorates from what is ultimately an unviable system that's leading to human extinction, that is capitalism and a constantly expanding system on a finite planet. You can't have a constantly expanding system on a finite planet. It will destroy the planet. So as humanity recognizes that it's on the road to extinction under capitalism, revolutionary ideas such as those in Cuba can become a material force for a new world. A new world is possible. And so the inspiring example of Cuba, I think, is important for us to make that material force, the ideas become a material force and change capitalism, or really end capitalism and end imperialism, and start a new world where humanity can live in peace and prosperity together as one, as Marx and Engels projected in their many writings. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Larry, for a great presentation. Thank you, everybody, for discussion. We're going to stop the recording now and just open up the mics.
Before you do, could you remind people who enjoyed and benefited from Larry's talk to tell their friends about us and join our discussion, because I think it's very fruitful. So I just want other people to know about us, that's all.
Good point, good point. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to stop it now, the recording.
All right, and we'll open it up. Anybody who wants to, if we want.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses, since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com. And the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.